First up, then, carbohydrates. What are we talking about here? There's a weird formula, and this is the formula that they want us to know, so it's kind of daft, but so along all this mess, x's and y's. But I'll tell you what, x and y is pretty much always the same number. It's, so though that x and that y is almost always equal to each other. And so, for example, if x is 6 and y is 6, then that's glucose, C6H12O6. That y on the outside is multiplying everything that's in the brackets by 2, or by y rather, I should say. So imagine x and y are 6. Then you're going to have C6H12O6, which is glucose. So that's the general formula. Usually the ratio is 1:2:1. There's twice as much hydrogen atoms as there is carbon and oxygen, and the carbon and oxygens are equal. But that's the formula they want you to know, right? So we're talking about carbohydrates being either in one of 3 types. You're talking about monosaccharides, and that's the single sugar unit, or the single subunit, if you like, of carbohydrates, right? Is a monosaccharide. Disaccharides, di for 2 sugar units. Polysaccharides. If you're looking for examples for monosaccharides, so we've quite a few in our course. If you think about it, we've got glucose, we've got fructose, you've got what else have we got? Sorry, glucose and fructose for monosaccharides. When you talk about disaccharides, we've got lactose. Oh, sorry, not lactose. That's a monosaccharide. You've got maltose, which is the product of the breakdown of starch. If you know your starch broken down by amylase to give you maltose, that's a disaccharide. Sucrose is in fact the odd one out, and I'll tell you why it's the odd one out. Because sucrose is the only one that doesn't test positive in the test for non-reducing sugars. So yeah, sucrose it gives a kind of, it's the one, of course, it's the one that's the most common, and it doesn't work in the sugar test, right? So that's a bit daft, really. Not much of a sugar test, is it? But other sugars will. Anything you can think of other than sucrose will. So lactose in milk, glucose, fructose in fruit. What else did I say? Yeah, those 3. Any of those 3 foods that contain those will test positive. Polysaccharides, we're talking about usually long chains of sugar units of monosaccharides. And they can be arranged in just single chains, or usually it's more complex than that. They're kind of linked, chains are linked together. There are lots of chains, but they're linked together. And you have examples like starch and cellulose. They're both polymers, is a good word, right? Polymers of glucose. But they're just, the glucoses are arranged differently in different kind of, chains, and the way that chains are linked together. So cellulose is, for example, like, even though it's all made of glucose, we can't break that down. We just don't have the enzymes that can break the bonds between the cellulose, between the individual sugar units, between the monosaccharides. But we can break down starch because we've got the enzymes to cope with it. So when we're looking at all of these biomolecules, there's 2 big things that you want to be making sure that you know, all right? And you'll see them in the notes. They're writ large in the notes. Under carbohydrates, you need to know 2 structural roles and 2 metabolic roles. Now, explain what those are. So structural role is anything that, a function, for example, that carbohydrates have in building something. So in what way are carbohydrates used to build things in living organisms? Examples. Good to have 2. So here's 2. So for example, cellulose, that's the polysaccharide we just looked at. It's used as building material for cell walls in plants. Not the only thing, but it's mostly what you'll find in cell walls in plants. When we look at plants later on, you'll see that the cell walls of some plants are laid down with an extra stuff called lignin, which strengthens it. But cellulose is the main component of cell walls. Chitin is a similar kind of material. It's also polysaccharide, but it's what you find, it's the equivalent that you find in fungi in their cell walls. So fungal cell walls and plant cell walls are not the same. They're both cell walls, but they're made of different stuff. Cellulose in cell wall of plants. Chitin is the polysaccharide that you find in the cell walls of fungi, right? When it comes to a metabolic role, what we're looking for here is any energy, any role and any function that the carbohydrates, for example, have in an energy transaction in the cell. Anything where there's energy involved, energy release or energy usage, I suppose you could say is a metabolic role, right? So, so like the classic one is respiration, right? Respiration is a classic use of, and it needs to be a use of, right? A use of a carbohydrate. So could be glucose, generally it is, could be fructose, you can respire fructose and other monosaccharides, but like I said, you can also respire other things. But generally we're talking about, when we're talking respiration, we're talking about respiration of carbohydrates. That's the main pathway. So this is an example of a metabolic role. You also have storage of carbohydrates that's not structural, right? Glycogen doesn't have any role in the function of the liver in terms of how it's built or how it's formed, its composition. It just happens to be that, and we're not very good at this, by the way, we can store small amounts of carbohydrate, complex carbohydrate, in the form of this thing called glycogen. It's a polysaccharide, right? We can store some of it, a little bit in our muscles, and animals in general can store it in their muscles, a little bit in our liver. That's kind of it. So we're not very good at storing carbohydrates. Plants are amazing at it. Plants can store huge amounts of starch just as well for us, because then they go to the trouble of making the stuff and then storing it, and we come along and, pull them out of the ground and eat them. So that's our go-to source of energy in general, is starch. Okay. These are, we're going to see these, over the time. Just one question. I just see a question there. Thank you, Lillian. How are monosaccharides bonded? Yeah, we don't need to know, and it's because it's not straightforward. There's different kinds of bonds. That's why I'm saying the chains that are formed in cellulose and in starch are not the same, right? So these are there's different kinds of ways that the glucoses, that the chains of glucoses can be put together. So we don't need to go into it, which is just as well, really, right? But you're absolutely right. We do need to know it for when it comes to protein. So I'll have a look at that in a second. These two equations are the two most, I think they're actually the only two equations you need to know, but you need to know them perfectly. And you need to know not the word versions of them, but the chemical versions, just like you see them here. What you'll notice, though, which makes our life a lot easier, is that one is the opposite or the backwards version of the other. So these are both examples of metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the cell. You can break metabolism up into two categories. Either it's catabolic, in other words, there are metabolic reactions that are occurring in the cell which break down large molecules to produce small ones, and energy is released. That's the key thing about this. It doesn't say it on there explicitly, but look at it in the equation. Energy is released in a catabolic reaction, and that's a really important thing. It's not just that it's breaking down larger molecules into smaller ones. The opposite of that is, and the classic example of a catabolic reaction is the chemical reaction that happens in a mitochondria, aerobic respiration, where glucose is further broken down to release the energy from it, and carbon dioxide and water are produced, water vapor. Anabolic reactions are the opposite. There are where smaller molecules generally are built, smaller molecules are put together combined into larger molecules, complex molecules, and that requires energy. Of course it does. It's to build things, right? So it does, of course, require